One of the first topics that we're going to cover in this chapter is exposure and color management. And we're doing that because it's one of the most crucial steps whenever you're working with light inside of a 3D software tool like Blender, for example, that you're working with proper exposure values. Now, I know I've said before that in the end, all that matters is the end result, right? So if the image looks good, it does look good. But if you're not working with proper exposure values, you're losing a lot of detail in your image, which you can't recover even with post-processing because that data is now lost since you burned it into your, final rendered image. So knowing how to light up a scene and use proper exposure is actually a vital skill for your renders to turn out good. All right, so here we have our scene in this Blender file. Let's hop on over to rendered view. And since this is a cycles chapter, obviously we're looking at a cycles render. Now this is looking quite good. And you can see that we have a fairly darkly lit room. Now by eye, this looks relatively well exposed, right? And I guess to an extent, there's not much wrong with this image. It feels a little bit dark, but then again, it's fine. Now, one way we could increase or decrease the amount of light in our scene is to go over to our world settings here, to our sky texture, and basically just change the strength, right? We could set it to 0.1, make the room darker, or we could increase the intensity like to 2 or something and make the room lighter. The thing with this is that this mainly controls only the sunlight that's coming in through our windows. And that's the major light source in this scene, but it's never going to affect the light coming from here. So all the parts that are lit up by our sun lamp here are now more lit up, and all the other parts which are getting lighting from our lamp here do not get that same boost in intensity. So this is not a proper way to completely correct your exposure in your image. Instead, let's just change this back to 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to the render properties. And basically this whole lesson boils down to the tab here. So we're currently using the new view transform, or actually there's a newer one called the Chronos PBR neutral, but the big release before that in 4.0 is AGX, and we're using the punchy look. And then there's 2 more sliders down below here, exposure and gamma. Now we're not really going to toil with gamma. Basically changing the gamma value changes the view transform after it's applied. So you make the whole scene lighter or darker. So as you can see over here or here, yeah, that's not really how you want to treat exposure. So let's just leave the gamma at 1 and instead let's work with our actual exposure value. And as you can see, if we use that, we actually get proper exposure changes. And this is what we want to control our exposure. Our sun lamp is set to 1. We have the lights here emitting some light, and we need some way to determine how properly exposed our image is. Again, like I said, the color management tab has the fix for this. So if we change the view transform here from AGX to false color, immediately you get a very ugly but very informational image that will tell us a lot about our scene. So what this does is it takes all the bright and dark ranges in your image and it displays them in a color range ranging from black to white. White meaning completely overexposed, losing all the data in terms of overexposure, and black meaning losing all of your image data in terms of underexposure. And this thing sort of ranges as a rainbow color, right? So the darker bluish, purplish colors, those are underexposed, and the red or even white, orange, and yellow colors are the parts that are overexposed. If we change this back to our AGX here, the parts on the wall here, which are very well lit up by our sun lamp, as you can see, if we change it back to false color, are now dark red, meaning that these parts actually have quite a decent amount of exposure, maybe even a little bit too much. Having said that, we are currently using an exposure of 1. If we set it to our default value, we can simply do this by hovering over it and pressing backspace, which is resetting it to its default value, which is 0, you can see that it's actually quite a bit different. Blue values are underexposed, or black values are underexposed, and white values are overexposed. So our ceiling light here, for example, is overexposed, which makes sense, right? It's not a bad thing to have certain parts under or overexposed, but generally speaking, you want the largest amount of your image, the largest parts of your image to be something of a greenish grayish color. Gray means that it's perfectly, well, basically medium exposed, so it's not overexposed and not underexposed, and greenish is, well, sort of close to that. So what we want is an image that is as green as possible, but still we want to have some control over the artistic value of our light here. So if we increase our exposure here, you'll start seeing that a lot of these colors change. And if we turn it all the way up, our image is completely white. If we turn it all the way down, our image is completely blue. And for this scene, since we're working with a natural light scenario with a lot of sunlight coming in, it's not a bad thing for certain parts to have a little bit of overexposure because, well, if you look at photos of sunlight tends to overexpose things, right? And we need to compensate for that in the image, but it's not a bad thing if certain smaller parts of our image, like some of these highlights on the chair here, maybe these parts on the carpet, the guitar catching light, you know, some of the wall here, that those parts are a little overexposed. So I feel if we put this as 0, it feels a little bit dark, right? If you were standing in this living room and it's, you know, daytime and the sun is shining out, there's no clouds and it's a bright sunny day, then this room feels too dark. It feels unnaturally dark even. So I feel like that if we increase our exposure a little bit, maybe to 0.5 or so, or maybe a 0.75, that our image looks that much better. And if we go back to false color, we are now seeing that we get some overexposure in these sunny areas over here on the wall, on the carpet, and some of the guitar. But generally speaking, we still have some oranges on the wall as well, some oranges on the carpet, and some oranges on the guitar. So it's not completely overexposed. So something around 0.75, maybe 0.6, 0.65, something around these values works really well for this scene. And that's basically how you do exposure for a scene. You want to do this after putting in some lights and, you know, after finishing your scene, start working on exposure and treating your scene to make sure that it's properly lit and you're not losing too many details. Besides exposure, we're also going to cover color transform or color management. And we're using our view transform here to basically go from a log image, which is an image like this, to a, well, graded image using some of these view transforms that are available to us. Now, before AGX, we always tended to use Filmic, but with the introduction of AGX, our highlights are much better if we use AGX color transform. So let's just go ahead and use that. Now, the look by default is set to none. This is basically just a personal preference. I like a lot of contrast in my images, so I tend to use punchy, which is the most contrast you can get within the AGX view transform. But you can, you know, use all the other ones as well. It's basically your personal preference, right? And it also kind of depends on how much you're tweaking this after the fact in different softwares, for example. But yeah, going with punchy is usually a good thing. You can also go with Filmic Log and do all of the grading in some other tool, like for example Photoshop. And you can also use this new Chronos PVR one and, you know, get some high contrast in there as well. But usually this kind of oversaturates the colors in a scene like this, since the Chronos PVR neutral is aimed towards product renders specifically, which are very well lit usually and stronger in color. So what I would recommend, generally speaking, is just use AGX and use either of the looks that you like. In my case, I use punchy. So make sure you understand how to do this properly before, you know, sending over your work to potential clients or whatever. Understanding exposure makes all the difference in your final product. All right, so that covers this lesson, and let's continue to our next one, where we'll cover how to use HDRIs in our scenes.